Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. We are going to be launching our Challenges in International Student Demand and Recruitment Strategies in Canada, US, and UK. We're going to be touching on strategies that are utilized by Canada, and then also listening to our UK and USA colleagues talk a little bit about how their partners are tackling the pandemic and then other recruitment challenges. So we'll do a quick introduction of how IDP has been doing that. With our full omni-channel approach and students first approach, we've really invested a lot in our platforms and along with our unrivaled physical network that really gives us a robust base to really help institutions out of pandemic and rebound stronger. So we'll do a quick intro here of our speakers. My name's Tal. I'm your Team Canada colleague. I'm joined by my colleagues in the US, Ellie and Ryan, as well as Ed over in the UK. I'll let them do a brief introduction of themselves. Ellie, do you want to go next?
Sure. Thanks so much, Tal. Hi, everyone. My name is Ellie Butler. I am Head of Marketing for North America here at IDP Connect. Pleasure to be joining you today for this session.
Hi everyone, I'm Ryan Fleming. I'm a client director with IDP Connect, just across the border in Buffalo, New York. Really excited to be here this morning. Thanks so much.
Hi, and I'm Ed, Head of Client Partnerships in the UK. I work primarily with UK and Irish universities, joining you from South London. Yeah, hi to all our Canadian colleagues.
Awesome. So if you aren't familiar with IDP, I'll do a quick understanding of what IDP is. So we're the largest globally connected community. And what that essentially means is that we have the digital expertise as well as the physical expertise and everything in between. Our websites have over 100 million users across 40 connected websites. Our counselor network is very large, of roughly 12,000 counselors across 130 different offices in 30 plus countries. And we've started providing strategic expertise to our partners through our data intelligence, which Ellie is going to touch upon quite significantly in her portion. So we're excited about that. And we're really helping our partners be more strategic rather than tactical. Brian's going to raise a great point later on, but I think the idea is to have a robust strategy for recruitment rather than what we've kind of been doing for the past few years and relying on factors outside of recruitment that we don't actually have any influence or but they do affect us. So we're going to go on to we'll quickly show you our websites. These are our 40 connected websites where we generate the demand as well as the data that backs up our IQ and intelligence services, as well as our research and consulting area. We do have global reach, so this allows you to reach your students in a medium that they are expecting to be reached. Now that offices are closed, very few students can actually walk in and talk to someone in person. Hopefully that'll change, but it's nice to be able to connect with students in a virtual format in their local countries. And we touched upon our research and data capabilities. So we provide on-demand services where you can look at real-time student demand as well as competitor data. We provide consulting services, things like portfolio and gap analysis, which we're going to look at next. And really help you figure out where you should be recruiting and why. So if you're interested in learning a little bit more about these, please get in touch with me and I'll be happy to expand on that. One more click. There we go. Didn't know this one had an animation, guys. So we touched upon this. These are our several areas where we cover in terms of our IQ research and consulting. We can do demand analysis, competitor analysis, portfolio intelligence to really help you figure out whether your portfolio matches the labor market. So we can do an LMI qualitative analysis as well. And then also large reporting is available for you to make internal decisions with senior stakeholders on a variety of different levels. So for our agenda today, I touched upon this a little bit. We're going to talk a little bit about the Canadian state of international recruitment in Canada and what the destination drivers are for students really looking to come to Canada, and we're also going to look at some of the impacts of sources outside of Canada. So Ellie's going to talk a little bit about the U.S. election survey and other research that we've taken on. Ryan's going to touch up on our U.S. partners that are in the strategies they're utilizing, and then Ed's going to give us some insights from overseas about what the UK market has been doing. UK has been doing some of these things for quite a long time, so I think there's some really good lessons that we can learn from the UK and the USA. So I'll do a quick overview of the Canadian international landscape. I'll start pretty broad on what's been the primary driver for Canada in terms of student recruitment. It's largely been policy-based, and you can see here, Canada's really being proactive regarding the pandemic and wanting to welcome new residents to Canada, because one of the reasons for that is that we realize that we have a severe shortage of people. We're a country with the second largest geographical landmass with a population of less than 40 million. That's some cities in certain countries. So there's a really aggressive growth plan to welcome new international students and have them turn into PRs, permanent residents. So we really rely heavily on our international students, and I think we've mostly relied on organic demand. It's not really much been driven by recruitment strategies or even tactics. We've just relied on the fact that Canada's fantastic and everybody wants to come study here. We have world-class education. But as we go through some of the research, you'll see that student perceptions for Canada are largely based, or choosing an institution in Canada is largely based on Canada rather than the institutional brand. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And then we'll look at, things like, should you be doing a portfolio analysis? Should you be doing a gap analysis? Should you be looking at labor market indicators and how those can tie into adoption of new technology-based recruitment strategies? Things like access to real-time data, having your content displayed on an omni-channel platform. So those are the things we're going to touch up on. But I think I'm going to hand it over to Ellie to go over to the next slide. Just as a quick snapshot here. So this is demand that we've seen since January. And what you see here is that the rise of the USA is pretty significant following the election. And I think we've gotten kind of comfortable in Canada of having this overwhelming demand, where we had more demand than we had available seats. But I think some of that is going to start to change with the postgraduate work permit in the UK being introduced last year, and the US election making it a more favorable environment for international students. And as you can see, there's a pretty significant rise in market cap. So US is neck and neck with us, and UK is not far behind. So I'm sure there's some really good lessons we can learn from our colleagues down south and overseas. So I'm going to hand it over to Ellie at this point. She's going to talk a little bit about our research. And then we'll also do a discussion at the end where we're just going to kind of throw out ideas and see how we can help you guys.
Cool. Thanks so much, Tal. So we are obviously talking about competitor destinations to Canada today and what's working for them, but I'd like to provide some context as to why this topic is so relevant right now and what our data and surveys are showing. And ultimately, this all points to why Canadian institutions should be refining their strategies, developing and using data in order to stay competitive in the global marketplace. So first, I'm going to share a bit of data from a recent survey we did on international student perceptions of the US following the election of Joe Biden and how those results affect Canada. So IDP Connect conducted this research as we sought to understand the impact of the 2020 election on prospective international student attitudes and intentions toward the US as a destination country. We know that international student demand and mobility to the US had slowed over the past several years. So we wanted to conduct this survey to capture any shifts in international student demand and to capture shifts that might ultimately end up affecting international student mobility to Canada, to the UK, and other competitor destinations. So really important for Canadian institutions to be aware of this as you track international mobility trends. So this research included a 7-minute online survey, which was out in the field in January and February, and the audience was prospective international students who have not yet started their applications. We had over 900 respondents in total. And one of the questions we asked was, how do prospective students view the US following the results of the election? So the headline finding of this research was that 76% of prospective international students said their perception of the US is now better following the results of the election. 17% say their perception of the US is about the same, and 7% said it has actually worsened. So quite a significant chunk there who is saying that they now have more favorable opinions of the US. We also asked students about their likelihood to study in the US following the 2020 presidential election, and 67% of respondents said that they are now more likely to study there as a result of the election. 27% reported no change in their likelihood, and 5% said they're now less likely to study in the US. So really encouraging signs for US institutions, but what does this mean for Canada and other competitor markets? So perhaps not surprisingly, when we asked the students if they are considering any other destinations, 50% of them said they are also looking at Canada, 41% looking at the UK, 28% at Australia, and so on. So we know that these students are looking at the US and have a more favorable opinion of it, but they're still considering these other destinations who have great offerings. So we did notice an interesting distinction in these other destinations that students are interested in when we break it down by students' region, their home country. So respondents from Africa and South Asia were more likely to be looking at Canada in addition to the US, while students from the Middle East and Southeast Asia were more likely to be looking at the UK as their top choice next to the US, followed again by Canada. So really interesting that there is this difference in breakdown of interest by source country, but also, really critical for Canadian institutions to be aware that this could mean that some demand will be taken from them and more students may be interested in studying in the US. In addition to this potential shift in demand due to the election, there are also other factors at play that can be a challenge for Canadian institutions. So these next few slides that we'll look at come from our series of Crossroads research, which, as you may know, examines student attitudes and intent in regard to studying abroad during the coronavirus pandemic. We actually just released the highly anticipated 4th round of this research at this conference. So be sure to check out that session in the presentation gallery. And the Crossroads surveys looked at thousands of international student applicants and offer holders to examine their attitudes and sentiment. So one of the questions that we asked in these surveys is the reason that students chose to apply to different destinations. And you can see here there were a range of options that students could choose from the quality of teaching to affordability to climate and so on. And interestingly, what emerged is that Canada ranks much lower than the other destinations for my institution or university of choice is located there. So you can see this second one here, the other destinations ranking much higher than Canada. And we actually see that students are choosing Canada because they think it's safe, it's more affordable than other destinations, and there is part-time work available. So clearly, there are different reasons why students are choosing Canada. When we look at this a bit further, we can see that these same results came through in another question. So we also asked students, how important were the following factors in your decision to study abroad? So between the subject or course they want to study in the red, the destination country in the orange, and the institution in the yellow, you can see how students answered these questions. So I'll call your attention to the fact that the orange here for destination country is pretty high across the board for all of these source countries, whereas the institution, being the primary reason that students chose where they're going, is across the board near the bottom. So again, really interesting that Canadian bound students are more interested in coming for the country than the institution. When we contrast this with students who were applying to the US, UK, and Australia, we see that the subject or course and the institution were in many cases much more important than the actual destination country. So again, it's that interest in the quality of teaching, the destination, the institution being the #1 thing that students are interested in traveling for. So I think with that data in mind and using that as context for the rest of our conversation, I'm now going to pass it over to Ed Kelly, who will dive into talking about some of the competitor destination tactics, specifically what he is seeing in the UK.
Thanks, Ellie. Thank you so much for having me today. And I want to cover really some of the things in the UK that are challenges for institutions right now, and how traditionally UK universities have approached their marketing and recruitment strategies, which are increasingly intertwined. To set the scene, I'd like to first cover really what I think are the three big things that are across the desks of international directors in the UK right now. And I've managed to go 30 seconds without saying the word Brexit, which is pretty good going for a presentation about the UK. But I'll kind of start with that one because it's such a big piece for the UK this year. For those of you who kind of maybe not be aware, Brexit is a really significant issue for UK universities because for students starting their course from this September onwards, there are two major things that change for European students coming to study in the UK, or EU students coming to study in the UK. First of all, it's more expensive. So they no longer are able to access education in the UK at the home fee level. They have to pay international fees from 2021, 22 intake onwards. And secondly, they cannot access the UK student finance loan system. So they can't get a loan to fund their studies either. What it's meant is that for those universities who are particularly reliant on EU students for their revenue base and for their diversity, they've seen a significant drop. And actually the University Central Admissions Service, which processed the applications of the vast majority of home and EU students, have seen a significant drop in applications for this intake. The other thing I want to touch on is diversity, which is if there's one thing that I can kind of bet will always come up in a meeting with a UK university, it's the word diversity. And particularly, that's been an issue this year where we've seen Chinese students actually become even more rankings focused. So for a lot of our international directors, they're really thinking about diversity as it relates to non-Chinese students. And this is particularly a pressure point on certain programs. I'm sure that a lot of Canadian universities will see a similar thing. And Tal's already mentioned what is actually formally called the graduate immigration route, which is effectively our answer to post-study work. The UK was without a post-study work scheme since 2012 up until very recently. So we've been operating without that for a significant number of years. And that's been wrapped up in a lot of the kind of political issues within the UK. Students were kind of, for a while, counted in the net migration figures, and there was a target to bring that down. And overall, there wasn't a particularly welcoming message to prospective international students. The graduate immigration route has kind of significantly changed that. And on the next slide, what you'll see is a slightly zoomed out picture for UK demand. So what we're looking at here is prospective students from India who are looking across our websites. And the y-axis relates to the percentage of demand for the different destinations. And then obviously the x-axis is a weekly point in time. So one of the things that you'll see here, if you kind of cut to the next animation, is that the graduate immigration route significantly grew the UK demand at the top of the funnel. So that was the week that the graduate immigration route was announced. It was the 9th of September, after a significant amount of lobbying from UK sector kind of stakeholders. And immediately the UK saw an uplift of about 10% in terms of the demand that we're seeing from Indian students. Now, I know we should be careful to kind of think about correlation and causation, but this is a pretty significant piece of evidence that this is a primary driver from this market. And what we've seen in the kind of subsequent 18 months or so since this has been announced is that many institutions have actually seen a really significant increase in Indian students on campus. The second thing that's happened over the last year or more than a year now is that there's been a pandemic. Obviously, everyone knows that. One of the things that obviously meant is that Australian borders remained relatively closed. And I think what's happened is the UK has maintained a share out of being kind of relatively open. International students have been able to travel, they've been able to, some of them they've had to quarantine or stay within their accommodation and have had less face-to-face teaching. But most students from India in particular have remained kind of very determined to study if they can see face-to-face teaching on the horizon. So they've kind of been happy to come and study in the UK, even if it's just going to be in their kind of university accommodation with the prospect of face-to-face teaching returning. And whereas the Australian demand has declined because their borders remain relatively closed, that I think has inflated the UK position within India. The final thing, which relates back to your comments earlier, Ellie, is around what we saw in light of the US election. And I think some UK universities see that as a risk, with regards to competition from the US. We saw earlier in your slides the kind of drivers for study in Canada, and the fact that in some ways the UK is quite a similar market to Canada. I think there are a couple of changes. The first is that for a lot of prospective students, they see the UK as a destination with institutions that they are kind of their kind of main choice institutions. And so what I'd like to talk about over the next couple of slides is just what institutions are doing to maintain a competitive edge. So if we go on to the next slide, I think this is the way that for certainly the last 5 years or so, UK universities have been thinking about their marketing and recruitment strategies and thinking broadly about kind of student acquisition. And it comes back to this piece around competition. You've got a decline in EU students. You've got quite a turbulent situation when it comes to Chinese students coming into the UK, and you've got Indian enrollments kind of on the up. Competition is kind of more fierce in the UK than it ever has been. And so for a lot of institutions, when we talk to them, their strategies have been a lot about post-application support, working with the students and making sure that conversion is really effective, reducing down application to offer turnaround times, and so on. But that's been coupled with top of funnel awareness activity, which I think is so important. There's 160 universities in the UK. And so in many cities, there's more than one university, and there's quite a lot of competition actually within the UK. And although the UK, from our research, shows that prospective students choose the UK because their primary choice destination institution is there, not all institutions are created equal. And some institutions have a bigger brand awareness raising piece to do than others. So the awareness and consideration stage is a really, really critical point in time for UK universities. And I think what we've seen over the last 3 or 4 years is institutions increasingly operating in this space. I think if you were to ask institutions 10 years ago, there would be some institutions who just wouldn't have entertained top of funnel awareness raising. But right now, I think content marketing and top of funnel marketing has become a really important part of effectively every institution's strategy within the UK. The other thing that we've seen is a lot more activity to try and link up the different stages within this funnel. So if you go to the next slide, I'll kind of talk about the 2 primary ways that I think UK universities have been approaching these 2 strategies. So the first is, in a crowded market, the content that you put out is absolutely critical. And some UK universities are guilty of not having a very well-defined, unique selling point or proposition. In fact, if I have to read world-leading research, new building, or one of these kind of very overused phrases on a piece of university marketing material, again, I think I might scream. But one of the really important things is having rich content that really tells a story about your brand is so important. Now, IDP Connect in the UK has worked with institutions in this way a little bit. And I'm using Ulster as an example of something that's good, rather than sort of naming and shaming. Who have really lent into their brand messages. An institution, small institution in Northern Ireland that offers really practical based learning and has a set of marketing messages that demonstrates to prospective students what their institution is all about. And that's so important. You know, at the application stage, we know that a typical Indian student will apply to 5 or 6 UK universities. probably more for some students as well. And so if that's the kind of shortlist stage, what's happening before that is that students are researching and looking at far more institutions. So being able to create desire about your university brand at this stage is so, so important. So that's the kind of first thing that I think UK universities are increasingly doing and increasingly getting right. The second thing is, and we all know that interactions with students exist in these particular silos. So the interaction at a student event, the time that a student spends on your website, the application stage, these are quite siloed individual events. And I think what institutions have been doing, both in their domestic marketing and in their international marketing, increasingly is retargeting students at the various different stages, trying to link up all those different stages and kind of keep that kind of awareness between perhaps core search and application, or between application and offer. And that's been done through display marketing, as we can see on the screen here, but also through being really effective with their work in their CRM and their kind of email conversion paths as well. So a couple of things that I'd say are kind of key takeaways from this. The first is, I showed in the data slide that there is quite a lot of flux within destination demand within key markets. And I think UK universities are being really, really efficient at employing data to kind of make sure that their strategy is protecting and not leaving them left behind. And so that would be my first takeaway. The second takeaway is having a content marketing strategy and really defining your unique selling points as an institution has never been more important. And that's kind of my second takeaway. And the third is thinking about how you can join up the very individual touch points along your funnel through retargeting or through kind of ongoing marketing messages is a really efficient thing to be thinking about. And we know some institutions have seen great success with this. So those are my kind of three takeaways from the UK market. And I think now I'm handing over to Ryan to talk about the US. So I'll hand over to you, Ryan.
Thanks, Ed. Those are great points. Hopefully I can complement with some of my own. So again, thanks for having me, everyone. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the ways that US institutions recruit international students. And I always kind of grapple with this question because implicit in the question is the suggestion that there is one coherent answer. And the reality is that the American context is a little bit different than some of our peers. Ellie, if you'd advance the slide for me. So I'm really interested in the way that culture intersects with and informs some of these questions. We don't have the time to give it the treatment it deserves, so just a few brief points instead. We're very culturally decentralized. The concept of the United States is almost Orwellian in the sense that in terms of the approaches, the ideologies, and the strategies that are employed, there's not really a united approach at all. So keep in mind that even for primary and secondary school, there is no national curriculum the way you might find in other countries with a really strong federal government and federal oversight of the education process. And this has its history in our frontier legacy moving westward and so on with the local control of education. There was no national healthcare policy until the Affordable Care Act, and even that is still patchwork, and it's the subject of political battles with regard to the individual mandate and other things that would just be anathema in other competitor destinations in terms of a coherent national strategy towards something so centrally important. So as we pivot to considering higher education or inbound international study, we don't even have a national goal the way that other destinations, and I'm not just talking about the English-speaking destinations, but even countries that you might not intuitively think of as inbound study destinations. China, as one example, have a pretty ambitious goal of 500,000 inbound students. I think COVID may have disrupted the schedule on that slightly, but there are increasing competitors with comparatively robust national plans. The US just doesn't have one. So as we look within higher education, it's almost like peeling the layers off of an onion as we go down, and we find differences at every level. So within one state, you can have differences from each of the other 49 states. Texas is pretty different. Then within the individual state systems, you can have, for example, different institutions within the University of Texas system. You have the Texas A&M system. You have the University of Houston system with different campuses. and discrete institutions, actually, not just different locations. And then even within that same system, so for example, UT Austin and UT Arlington could have two completely different approaches, different policies and processes for the recruitment and enrollment of international students, despite the fact that they pertain to the same university system, which is a public university system in the same state, in the same country. There's also a certain attitude. We used to commission buyer behavior research on students, which looked at the student perceptions of different study destinations where IDP has student placement offices. And what we consistently found was that the student perceptions of academic quality were consistently the highest for the US. So there is a very pervasive view that the academic quality at US institutions is high. I would venture to say that that view is shared by the institutions themselves. I think there is, again, that cultural intersection of maybe American exceptionalism and a sense of, well, why should we have to be proactive? What's the need for a strategy? Can't we just kind of turn the lights on and the students will come? You know, if you build it, they will come kind of attitude. And if you advance the slide, we can see the next point here, Ellie. This is a recent email exchange that I had very conveniently earlier this week. And so as part of my remit in my job, I am looking for strategic partnerships with new universities who don't currently work with us to achieve their international enrollment goals. And this was one such institution, which will remain unnamed, but suffice it to say, it is a pretty powerhouse school in Florida, public school, large research university, land grant university. And I had solicited just through a casual email saying, hey, let's chat sometime and see if we can help you reach your enrollment goals. And this was the reply that I received. And there's a lot here. We don't work on international enrollment management at the undergrad level due to high demand for enrollment from Florida residents. So two pieces there. There are silos in US universities, even between undergrad and postgraduate, or what we would call graduate study. You can see in the second paragraph, this individual goes on to say, international enrollment at the graduate level is handled by our graduate school, and they have their own recruiting team. So even further, you go down even further in the onion, and even at the same exact school, there are different areas of responsibility and a really sclerotic and schizophrenic approach to recruitment, where one side doesn't necessarily coordinate with the other. They go on to summarize, we do not work with third parties regarding international enrollment, and just pointed out that the remit for this institution is really to focus on supporting the needs of Florida residents, which is the tax base that the school is funded by, and so on. So the focus is different. The silos make it difficult to discern a unified strategy. And there is just kind of the closing, you know, the door slamming at the end was just, in any case, we don't work with third parties at all. Now, being me, I did reply a bit cheeky maybe and just said, well, you know, that's a really interesting take. Thanks for sharing that. I imagine, though, that diversifying your student body by country of origin would still be theoretically desirable. And Ellie, you can advance to the reply I received from that. Thanks, Ryan. Yes, we value diversity. Goes on to describe a few things that actually they are doing. So even though it might seem like this institution, certainly in their own view, and with some of the channels that they have are do-nothings, or they don't really have a proactive approach, there are still certain tactics that they employ. So they do rely on international exchange partners for short-term exchanges, a short presence on campus for a semester or maybe one academic year. There are in-country transfers from community colleges. So there are a lot of local colleges, which for us just means awarding associate's degrees, which would be the first 2 years of undergraduate education, typically general education requirements, before transferring to this very well-known brand name university. And of course, you can't get far in the US without mention of sports. The collegiate sports scene is pervasive for good or ill. And so there is a conduit for recruitment of international students in the context of recruiting for the sports teams. So even the ones who aren't doing anything, if you dig a little bit, well, they are doing a few things. It's not really something where they're receptive to a central strategy. And we'll talk more about the difference in a moment. But on the next slide, you can see the result of kind of a crowdsourced groupthink that I had on LinkedIn with some colleagues, in addition to just my own thoughts off the top of my head about all the ways that institutions in the US are working to recruit students. I won't exhaust the whole list here, but you can see our first 3 entries from the previous slide. There are digital marketing or lead generation campaigns where you would be in the student journey as the product of an organic search on an aggregation site, not unlike IDP Connect. There are also list buys, which is basically the student took a test that you would accept for demonstration of English language proficiency. Social media, which isn't just kind of the big 3 of Facebook, Instagram, and maybe Snapchat or Twitter, depending, but also market specific platforms. So paying attention to being on WeChat if China is a focus for you, and so on. The Department of State initiative, the network of offices known as Education USA, host periodic events, and that's really the state sanctioned thing to do if you want to be a little more proactive. There are third-party event companies which don't have counseling wings, but they do offer, well, in usual times, they offer in-person events. So USEG in the Middle East would be one example. FPP EDU Media has recently gone all virtual, and they focus on Brazil. So they do operate in this space for the provision of events that you can attend. The idea is to get in front of prospective students that way, and so on and so forth. You can see relying on your alumni to provide that essential student voice at a certain point. Faculty-led recruitment, if you have some of those synergies on campus, you can leverage those. Being on the right list for sponsored students, SOCM is the big one. The BSMP in its heyday in Brazil was pretty important to be on before they went dry. Certainly the Omani and Kuwaiti lists are also of interest. In-country representation, which can interact with some of these other points, and that'll be really important in a moment, to have boots on the ground, so to speak. Academic summer programs, these were some other examples that were given by industry colleagues. Having an institutional website, sometimes when we bring up digital marketing discussions, the rebuttal is, well, yes, we know digital is important, and actually we have a website and it works pretty well, which is part of it. The last thing I would mention is these things that I will call admissions tactics. And by this, I mean levers that you can pull in order to grease the wheels of the admissions process for international students. You accept the Common App or you don't. Maybe you waive the app fee if you met a student at a fair or if they're applying through an agency. Maybe you offer an in-house credential evaluation, so you're not making students go and pay money to get their transcripts evaluated for your institution. Maybe you have someone who will do that for them. Maybe you have flexible deadlines for students in certain circumstances or applying to certain programs. And you can see on this last item on the list how this is really a tactic rather than a strategy. So we've been throwing these terms around, and I want to be really clear that having a list of tactics, of discrete things you can do, is not the same as having a coherent strategy. The reason why is because there's no interface between these items. There's no information about how they underpin and relate to one another in the provision of a strategy, which it's hard to see when it's a laundry list of things that we as an institution can do. But I want to flip the script and encourage you to think about it from the student journey perspective. Now, we all know what the end goal of the student journey is, and that's enrollment. That's the whole name of the game. But it's easy for us to forget what the journey looked like to get there. And so let's consider a sample student, and I would venture to say this is a pretty normal way that students would go from the top of a funnel down to enrollment. So a student conducts research maybe on Google or a local equivalent. They discover ABC University from an aggregation platform that comes up at the top of an organic search. They then navigate to that profile, get some information. There are embedded links in that profile which lead to ABC University's website. They go to the website to learn more. Now this student likes what he sees. He's got a few questions now. He's got kind of the basics, but he wants to know more. Fills out the inquiry form. Now, thankfully, ABC University has invested in an in-country representative who handles leads from this country, let's call it India. And so this person reaches out by phone and has a vetting conversation with the student, just finding out academic profile, ability to pay, making sure that this is a serious inquiry. And the representative mentions that, well, next month, there's actually an agent fair. Let's say it's through IDP. The roadshow's coming to Bangalore. And wouldn't you be willing to come down and meet with staff from our office? And you can talk to us further at that point. Student attends the fair. This is in a pre or post-COVID world. Take your pick. Let's be optimistic and say post-COVID. And then from there, with the pre-counseling that the agent offers, they say, you know what, this is actually a really good support system that I'm going to use to help me enroll. So with the student's help, the student with the agent's help, the student applies, they're admitted. There's an admitted student event involving ABC University alumni because they have a very healthy and well-developed international alumni network, which helps put the student's mind at ease at the end. And he secures his visa, he receives his orientation, and off he goes to enroll on campus. Now, the question absolutely is not what recruitment initiative or what tactic deserves the credit. That cannot be the substance of your attribution discussion. It has to be instead, how effective was each component of our recruitment ecosystem in meeting the student where he was at a given point in time. And ideally, from that laundry list of tactics, you will be able to put together a strategy that supports each stage of the journey, from the initial discovery awareness phase through to some of the more nitty-gritty support that the student will need as they prepare to depart and enroll on campus. So, of all the tactics that we've shared, I would encourage you to chart them on this graphic. And I think what you'll find is that almost all of them are about building capacity to manage interest. Some of them will be about building capacity to generate interest, but you have to understand the relationship between these two populations or between these two groups. Because answer the question, how does a student who ends up at step 5, enrollment, how does that student find out about you initially? In the US context, if you are not on the coasts, if you are not in New York, California, Texas, Florida, maybe Chicago, maybe Boston, you have an uphill battle in terms of awareness. That it could be that once a student gets to campus, they're very excited, motivated, and successful, and they contribute to that alumni success story that you have. But if you don't have the channels to allow an interested student to become aware of you, everything that proceeds from that is going to be hampered, and you're going to be left with a collection of disparate tactics that may not work, they may not be appropriate, or they may not be connected to anything else in a coherent way. Final point I want to share is that technology exerts downward pressure. And what I mean by that is 20 years ago, if you went to a student fair and I asked you, why don't you chart an education fair on this graphic, you might put it at step 1. Finding out about the university, maybe reading the sign and saying, hey, where are you guys located, and going from basically 0. That's not the case anymore. What we've found anecdotally within our counselor network is that students, like everything in life, technology has intersected and informed the process of finding out about study abroad options. And so increasingly the platforms and the avenues that students are going to use at the awareness phase are going to be moving from an analog to a digital space. And so be really mindful, not just in COVID. It's obvious in the COVID era where analog anything is almost impossible, that digital is important, but just even that is still thinking about you. Think about students and the way that they do everything from order food to call a cab to research their higher education options. I think you'll find that technology is going to be an invaluable part of any strategy. And there are a lot of channels out there that can help you get there and build a cohesive strategy through all these steps. So I'll turn it over now. I think we've got some key takeaways or discussion points.
Thanks, everyone. I think there's some great points, Ed and Ryan and Ellie. Canada's pretty similar in certain respects, but pretty different in other respects. To Ryan's point, most recently, that the U.S. is very decentralized, and even within the institutions there are silos. So we are very centralized because the public institutions are controlled by the government, and those are considered the best and cream of the crop in Canada. Whereas in the US, the private institutions are considered the best of the best. But we are also, in the large public institutions, they're very siloed. Departments don't often talk to each other, and the recruitment strategies are kind of disconnected. So I think one of the key points that I'd really like to focus on is that there's demand available. We've clearly seen through our data, there's students still willing to travel to their destination countries, and the tools are available to expose your content to these students. It's how you effectively manage both that are really going to be able to help you attract students to your institution. And to Ryan's point, how did the student first find out about you? it used to be that they show up at a fair, but now the landscape's changed. We're moving more towards a technology landscape. So I think it's really important for that. And then country and institutional brand. I think that's an important takeaway for Canadians, because we've heavily relied on our country brand, whereas the UK and the USA have established institutional brands as well as country brands. So I think we're kind of playing a little bit of catch up now, and Canada's in a very strong position because of the past few years of success that we've had. And there's a quote that I like to use is, you fix the roof while it's not raining. So you want to get ahead of these things and be proactive in your approach. And then, as Ryan mentioned, a list is not a tactic list is not a strategy. It's things that we do, but it's a matter of combining all of those into a cohesive plan.
All right. Well, thank you all so much for fantastic presentations and great insights that Canadian institutions can use and can implement to begin to build their institutional brand and to develop strategies that are going to attract and maintain more international students. Really fascinating points that I think were made. So thank you all. We want to thank everyone for taking the time to view this session. We appreciate you tuning in to us. Do keep in mind that the Crossroads 4 research that I referenced earlier is available in the presentation gallery. So we'd love if you would join us for that session as well. Otherwise, if you'd like to get in touch with us, we have Tal's email up on the screen here, but we are also available at idp-connect.com, and we'd love to hear from you. So thanks again, all, and everyone. Take care and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you for sharing your time with us. Hope you guys enjoy the conference.